Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Mishnah Mastery. We have got only one chapter that we're going to do tonight. Oh, here comes Adrian. Wonderful. We are going to do chapter 14 of Zevachim. But, ladies and gentlemen, we will be finishing Masechet Zevachim. So that's very exciting. Everybody say yay. Well, you're all muted, but okay. So, without further ado, everyone on Zoom, you're able to see the words of the Mishnah clearly? If you have me on full view, then it should be pretty easy. Would you say so? Thumb up? Brilliant. So, without further ado then, our first step of our new look broadcasting, we've got the words on the screen, and we've got everyone ready and raring to go. So here we go with chapter 14 of Masechet Zevachim, where we are talking about the laws again of shechting outside of where you are supposed to be shechting, which is a big, big no-no. And what we're going to see in Mishnah Aleph is how those laws apply to things that are not quite typical korbanot. So we're going to be starting in Mishnah Aleph by talking about the para aduma, which was slaughtered and burnt outside of the azara. So it's anyway being burnt outside, or being processed and slaughtered and processed outside. And the other one that we're going to talk about is the seir hamishtaleach, the goat, the scapegoat that was sent out on Yom Kippur. That was also taken outside of the azara, outside of the Beis Hamikdash. So the Mishnah says, Paras chatas shesrafa chutz migita. You've got the para aduma, the red heifer of the purification of chataot, which is being burnt outside its pit. So it was supposed to be burnt outside of the Beis Hamikdash anyway, and you are now burning it outside of that location. You're not even burning it in that place outside of the Beis Hamikdash. Similarly, the scapegoat, which is being sacrificed outside of the Azara, instead of being thrown off a cliff, which is the right process for it to have done to it. So, patur, the Mishnah says you are exempt from punishment because they were never supposed to be in the Beis Hamikdash anyway. Shneimar, as it says in the verse in Vayikra chapter 17, verses 3 and 4, Ve'el Pesach Ohel Moed lo heviu, and to the entrance of the Ohel Moed, of the Mishkan, of the tent of meeting, he did not bring it. To which the Mishnah learns, Kol she'eno ra'ui lavo el Pesach Ohel Moed, anything that was never fit to be brought to the entrance of the Ohel Moed, ein chayavin alav. They're not going to be liable if you then go and slaughter it or sacrifice it outside of the Azara, because it was never meant to be there. Mishnah base, we start off with our famous list of animals that never had the chance to be a valid sacrifice anyway at the time of slaughtering, at the time of shchita. Says the Mishnah, haroveya, if you have an animal that has copulated, who has managed to have relations with a person, vahanirba, or the animal has been violated as an object of bestiality, vamuktzeh, or it's an animal that's been set aside for idol worship, vahanevad, or it's an animal that was worshipped and not only set aside but was actually worshipped as a deity, as a avodah zarah, v'ha'esnan, or an animal that was used in payment for a prostitute, v'ha'mechir, or an animal that has been paid for at the same price as a kelev, as a dog, v'hakilayim, or an animal that is born of a forbidden mixture of parentage, v'hatrefa, an animal with a wound, a critical wound which is going to kill it within 12 months, v'yotze dofen, or an animal that was born by cesarean section, she'ikrivan b'chutz. All of these animals, since they were never fit to be in the sacrifices anyway, if they are then sacrificed outside of the Azara, the Mishnah says patur, you're exempt from the penalty of shchutei chutz. Shneimar, as it says in chapter 17 in Vayikra, lifnei mishkan Hashem, and it has been it was supposed to be before the Mishkan of Hashem. Kol she'eino ra'ui lavo lifnei Mishkan Hashem. Anything that was not fit to be at the entrance of the Mishkan Hashem, ein chayavin alav. You're not going to be liable if you then go and slaughter it or sacrifice it outside of the Azara. There's an exception which is left out, which is balei mumim, which is animals which are blemished, and that is because it is subject to dispute. It is subject to a machlokes. Says the Mishnah regarding balei mumin, regarding blemished animals. First position in the Mishnah, bein balei mumin kavuin, whether it is a fixed permanent blemish, bein balei mumin orin, or it's a temporary blemish, it's going to pass. Shikrivan bachut patur, if it is sacrificed outside of the Azara, you are going to be exempt from punishment. Rabbi Shimon Omer, however, Rabbi Shimon says that anything that is temporary, you're going to be liable for. Even though you might not be liable to the punishment of kares, of spiritual excision, it's still going to be violating a negative commandment in the Torah, because at some point it's going to be kosher again. It's going to be fit again. So Rabbi Shimon Omer, balei mumin kavuin patur. If it is a fixed permanent blemish, then they will be exempt. Uvale mumin over, and if it's temporary, over in Belosar said, and they violate a negative prohibition, and one will be liable for having violated that commandment. Says the Mishnah, Torim shlo igiyaz manam. If you have a dove which has not reached its minimum age for which it would be able to be brought as a sacrifice, uvnei yona, or turtle doves, she'avaz, or pigeon as it says on the screen, she'avaz manan shikrivan b'chutz, a turtle dove which is now too old to be fit for sacrificing, and yet you go and sacrifice these things outside of the Azara, they were never fit to be brought. So the Mishnah says, patur, they are exempt from punishment. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, b'nei yona she'avaz manan patur. If it is a turtle dove or pigeon that has passed its ripe old age of fitness, then patur v'torim shelo igiyaz manan. And if it is a dove which has not yet reached its minimum age for which it could be brought as a sacrifice, then Rabbi Shimon says, belot haseh, you violate a negative commandment in the Torah. If I'm not mistaken, they would have to be 7 days old before they would be fit to bring. So if you're bringing it in the days before it is 7 days old, then it is too early. Says the Mishnah, Oso ve'esbeno u'mechusar zman patur. That applies to that animal, ve'esbeno, and if it would apply to its offspring, which you're not allowed to sacrifice a bird. Well, you're not allowed to sacrifice two things that are related to each other. So if you have one bird, where are we on the screen here? So if you've got, I think we're talking about animals. If you've got the animal and you've got its offspring, which are slaughtered on the same day, which you're not allowed to do, and an animal who has not yet arrived at its right age. So if you sacrifice those outside of the Azara, outside of the temple, then patur, you're going to be exempt, because you were never allowed to sacrifice these animals on the same day. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, Harei zeh belot haseh. This would also be a violation of a negative commandment, because Shahaya Rabbi Shimon Omer, because Rabbi Shimon says, Kol shu ra'ui lavo la'achar zman. If at some point it's going to be fit for bringing in the Beis HaMikdash, then Harei zeh belot saseh ve'ein bo chares. They violate a negative commandment, but there is no punishment of spiritual excision. The Chachamim say, Kol she'ein bo chares ein bo v'lo ta'aseh. If there's not going to be a punishment of kares, a spiritual excision, then there's not going to be a violation of a biblical law either. You're not allowed to do it, but you're not going to be in violation of the actual biblical law as it was intended. Mishnah Gimel. Mechusar zman. What did we mean when we were talking about a korban which is mechusar zman, lacking the right age? So the Mishnah says, bein begufo, bein beva'alav. This would apply whether it was the animal that was not at its right age, or the bird, bein beva'alav, or if the owner has not arrived at the right time. Mishnah asks, Eizahu mechusas man beva'alav. What are we talking about when it is too early for its owner? The owner is not in the right time period to be able to bring this. So the Mishnah gives examples. Hazav, if you have a man who has experienced a gonorrhea-like discharge, v'hasava, or a woman who has had a zava discharge, violedes, a woman who has given birth, umatsora, or a person who is suffering from tsora'as and is supposed to be going through a purification process, shehikrivu chatasam va'ashamam bachut. So if these people bring these sacrifices on the wrong days, if they bring them too early as part of their processes, then, and they go and bring the chatas or the asham parts of their sacrifices outside of the azara, then Paturin, they're going to be exempt, as they were not yet obligated or permitted to be able to bring these sacrifices yet. But olotehen v'shalmehen bachut. But if they bring the ola part component sacrifice, or the shlamim component of their sacrifice, then bachut, if they do these things outside of the courtyard, then they're going to be chayavin, they're going to be liable. And that's because these things could, in theory, be brought as a voluntary sacrifice. So if it was a compulsory part, sorry, let me try that one again. If it was a korban which can only be brought in instances of a mandatory nature, then you're going to be patur. But if you were bringing a korban which in theory could be brought as a voluntary sacrifice, then the Mishnah says you would be liable for those things. Hamaleh mibasar chatas, a person who offers up outside of the temple courtyard some of the meat of a korban chatas which is supposed to be eaten, and this person goes and burns it up outside of the azara, or mibasar asham, or part of the flesh of the asham, the guilt offering, which was supposed to be eaten, mibasar kodshe kodshim, or the meat of any higher level sacrifice, mibasar kodshe kalim, or the meat of any lower level sacrifice which was not supposed to be burnt up, it was supposed to be eaten. Umosa ha'omer, or the leftovers of the korban omer from Pesach, which was supposed to be eaten. Ushtei alechem, the 2 loaves of Shavuos. Velechem apanim, the 12 showbreads that were arranged on the temple each week, which are then supposed to be given to the kohanim for eating. Ushiare menachos, the leftovers from the mincha offerings. Hayotzeik, somebody who pours oil onto a mincha, onto a meal offering, into the flour of the mincha offering. Habolel, one who mixes, is that right? Yeah, one who mixes the shemen, the oil, and the flour. Hapotes, one who breaks up and chops up the different parts of the loaves into pieces. Hamoleach, one who salts a mincha, a meal offering. Hamenif, one who waves a mincha offering. Hamagish, one who brings the mincha close to an altar, and this is all taking place outside of the azara. Hamasader sashulchan, a person who arranges the showbreads on a table, but we're doing this outside of the sanctuary. Vahametivis aneros, preparing the candles for the menorah, again outside of the azara, outside of where it's supposed to be done. Vakomet, someone who does kamitza, taking the handful of a flower from a mincha. V'hamakabel damim bachutz, or a person who collects blood, and they're doing all or any of these things outside of the destined location within the confines of the Beis Hamikdash. The Mishnah says patur. In all of these instances, you are going to be exempt from punishment. That's because, with regards to all of these last actions, it has nothing to do with the completion of a sacrificial service. These are all other components to a process, and therefore you're not going to be chayav. Says the Mishnah, "Ein chayavin alav lo mishum zarus." A person is not going to be liable for any of these actions if they were a non-priest who was doing them, v'lo mishum tumah, or if a person was doing these in a state of impurity, v'lo mishum b'chusa begadim, or if they were a kohen who was not wearing the required uniform, v'lo mishum rechutz yadayim v'raglayim, and even if they do these things not having washed their hands and their feet, whatever the case, if they are doing these things outside of the Beis Hamikdash, they are going to be patur from a punishment of kares if they do these things. Mishnah Daled, from here until almost the end of our chapter and almost to the end of our Masechta, we're going to be discussing periods of time when the prohibition of shechutei chutz, of sacrificing and offering outside of the designated location, when it would be not relevant, but when it would be in action. And this is all going to be based around the fact that at different points in Jewish history, you didn't only have to bring sacrifices on an altar inside the Mizbeach. In certain points in Jewish history, you were even allowed to have a private altar. And because you were allowed to have a private altar, that would mean that you could bring some of these sacrifices. So you're not going to be liable for sacrificing outside of the Beis Hamikdash or the Mishkan, whatever it might be, outside of the courtyard, because at different periods of time, you were allowed to do so. So there's a couple of Mishnayot now that we're going to see that take us through these different periods of Jewish history. So the Mishnah says, Ad shelo hukam hamishkan, from the moment Adam HaRishon was born until the point at which we erected a Mishkan, right, with Moshe Rabbeinu in the desert. So from the beginning of history until that point, Hayu habamot mutarot, it was permitted for people to have a private altar. They couldn't sacrifice every type of sacrifice, but they were allowed to do certain sacrifices on these private altars, and that was okay, that was allowed. And va'avodah babchoros, the sacrificial service would have historically been performed by firstborns. Mishahu kama mishkan, from the time in the desert when the Mishkan was established, from that point, ne'esru habamos, so private altars were forbidden, va'avodah ba'kohanim, and that was the point at which we inaugurated Aaron and his sons to be the kohanim, and to be the ones who would do the sacrificial services in the base, in the Mishkan. And from then on, it's always been kohanim. Kodshe kodshin, if a person was sacrificing higher level sacrifices, ne'chalim lifnim min ha'klayim, then those would have to be processed within the curtains of the Mishkan. Kadshim kalim b'chol machanei Yisrael, and if it was a lower level sacrifice, then it could be eaten anywhere within the camp of Israel, within the camp of the Jewish people. Then Mishnah Hey, then Ba'ula Gilgal, when the Jewish people entered into Eretz Yisrael and they had their Mishkan. So for the first 14 years, they built the Mishkan in the region of Gilgal. And it didn't have quite the same level of sanctity as the Midbar, as the desert. And that's because the Aron was not present in the Mishkan while it sat in Gilgal. Because the Aron, the Ark, was being taken around with Bnei Yisrael while they were waging war in the country. So Ba'ula Gilgal, the Mishnah says, once it came to Gilgal and it was there for 14 years, V'hutru habamot, at that point, they were allowed to have private sacrifices anywhere, wherever they found themselves. and that's because it didn't have the same status as the midbar. So they were allowed to do personal korbanot. Kodshe Kodshim, if it was a high level sacrifice, ne'chalim lifnim min hakloim, then it would only be allowed to be eaten within the curtains of the Mishkan. Kodshim Kalim, if it was a lesser level sanctity, b'chol makom, then they could be eaten anywhere, and they could be processed anywhere. Mishnah Vav, Bo'u l'Shilo. For 369 years, the Mishkan was established in Shiloh. And in fact, I think we've mentioned this before, the shul in Shiloh is built to look like the Mishkan. It's made out of concrete, but the shape, if you check out some pictures on Google Images, you'll see that the design of the building of the shul in Shiloh is designed to look like the Mishkan. And it sat there for 369 years when the Jews first came into Eretz Yisrael. So it had a degree of permanence. In fact, it's referred to in the Torah as being in a state of menucha. We'll come to that shortly. So Bo'u l'Shiloh. When it came to Shiloh, ne'esru habamot. So the private altars were forbidden again, which meant that they could only bring sacrifices in the Mishkan. At this point, lo haya sham tikra. It was a partial structure and a partial covering. Lo haya sham tikra did not have a permanent roof, but elabayis shelavanim milamatan virios milamalan. But what it did have was a building of stone foundation, and on the top were the curtains of the Mishkan. And this is what the Torah characterizes as being in a place of rest. It had come to rest. So in the verse in Devarim chapter 12, verse 9, in Parshas Re'eh, where it says, "For you have not as yet come to the rest and to the inheritance." So the rest refers to the 369 years that the Mishkan would spend in Shiloh, where it had a degree of semi-permanence. Higher level sacrifices would have to be eaten within the curtains, within the confines of the base of the Mishkan. Lesser level sacrifices and Maaseh Sheni, because we have to realize now that the farmers are starting to engage in agriculture. So these things would be eaten b'chol haro'eh, in any place that was in visual proximity of Shiloh. Mishnah Zion, eventually the Mishkan in Shiloh was destroyed. It was destroyed on the day that Eli died. And at this point, Shmuel Hanavi was in charge. And the Mishkan was moved to a place called Nov for 13 years, and then to a place called Givon for 44 years. So for 57 years, it had a degree of less permanence. So the Mishnah says, Bo'u l'Nov l'Givon, hutru habamos. When the Mishkan stood in Nov and Givon, for those 57 years, private altars were permitted once again. High-level sacrifices had to be eaten within the confines of the Mishkan. And lesser-level sacrifices could be eaten b'chol Ari Yisrael, in any of the cities of Eretz Yisrael. Note the word change between b'chol makom. We had B'chol Machaneh Yisrael in the camp of the Jews when we were in the desert. That was in Mishnah Daled. Mishnah Hey, we had B'chol Makom, in any place. And now, as there's a degree of stabilization and settlement for the Jewish people established now after hundreds of years living in Eretz Yisrael, B'chol Arei Yisrael, in the cities of Eretz Yisrael. Mishnah Ches. Now we come to Yerushalayim, the building of the Beis HaMikdash, and at this point, private altars are going to be prohibited, but they will also never be permitted again. So even though we now no longer have a temple, we still can't have private altars, and that's because of the Kedusha of Yerushalayim being so high level that we're never again going to have these private altars. Bo'u Yerushalayim, when the Beis HaMikdash arrives in Yerushalayim, ne'esru habamos. Private altars are forbidden. V'lo haya lahem od heta. They are never going to be allowed again. V'hi haisa nachala. And that is the word inheritance that the verse was alluding to before. It has not yet come to rest. That was talking about the Mishkan in Shiloh. And nachala, the inheritance, that is Yerushalayim, the Makom HaMikdash, the Beis HaMikdash. So from this point, Kodshei Kodshim, high-level sacrifices, Ne'achalim Lifnim Ne'klayim. They have to be eaten within the Klayim, which we translate as curtains, but it's just consistent wording to refer to the confines of the Beis HaMikdash, even though it's now a permanent building structure. Kodshim Kalim, lesser level sacrifices, Uma Sasheni, Lifnim Minachoma. They have to be eaten within the walls of Yerushalayim. Mishnah Tes. What happened if the laws changed while you're in the middle of bringing your sacrifice? What happens if at some point you're allowed to have a private sacrifice and then all of a sudden the laws changed and now you can't? So it's going to be linked to the time when you have consecrated your sacrifice. And there are three potential prohibitions, three potential averas that they would have to have been bearing in mind. There's a commandment to bring your sacrifice wherever Hashem allows you to do so, in the designated place that Hashem names, and you can't bring it anywhere else. So that's one potential avera. The second is to bring it whenever you want. There may be a particular problem of bringing it whenever you want. And the third prohibition is shechutei chutz, of sacrificing outside of its designated place. So first, we're going to deal with a case where you've consecrated your korban when you are not allowed to have a private altar. So the Mishnah says, Kol hakodshim shehikdishan b'shas isur bamos. If you sanctify, if you consecrate and designate a sacrifice at a time when you can't bring it on a private altar, v'hikrivan b'shas isur bamos b'chutz, and you bring it at a time when you're not allowed to have a private altar outside of the Beis HaMikdash, and you go and bring it outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Hare elu va'aseh v'lo sa'aseh v'chayavin alav kares. So then you have violated a positive mitzvah of sacrificing in the place chosen by God. You've violated a prohibition about sacrificing on a private altar, and you're going to be liable to spiritual excision for having done so. Second case, you're consecrating it when you're allowed to have a private bama, you're allowed to have a private altar, but you came to do it when it was forbidden. So hikdishan b'shas hetebamos. You consecrated your animal at a time when you would be allowed to bring it outside of the Beis HaMikdash or the Mishkan. V'krivan b'shas isur bamos. But then by the time you get around to sacrificing it, it's actually a time of prohibition for private altars. You have violated a positive mitzvah of failing to bring it in the place where God would want you to bring it. And you have violated the prohibition of sacrificing it on a private altar. But you're not going to be liable for kares. Not going to be liable for spiritual excision. Hikdishan b'shas isur bamos, if you designate it at a time when you're not allowed to have a private altar, vikrivan b'shas hetebamos, and you bring it at a time when you are allowed to have a private bama. So essentially, you've done nothing wrong because you're allowed to. But the trouble is, when you designated it, you had a mitzvah to take it to the Mishkan or to take it to the Beis HaMikdash, and so you haven't fulfilled that. So the Mishnah says, "Hare elu va'aseh," you have violated the commandment, the mitzvah of bringing the Mishkan in the place where you were supposed to. Ve'ein bahem b'lo taseh, but you have not violated the prohibition of sacrificing on a bama, on a private altar, because in principle you would have been allowed. As we come to our final Mishnah of chapter 14 and our final Mishnah, is it our final Mishnah? Yes. And our final Mishnah of Masechet Zevachim. So the Mishnah says, Elu Kodshim Kurevin Bamishkan. These are the sacrifices that could only be sacrificed in a Mishkan, in the tabernacle. And that's even when you were allowed private bamas. So even when it was in Gilgal or Nov or Givon, there were still sacrifices that could only be brought in the Mishkan and couldn't be brought outside of the Mishkan. Kodshim shehukdushu la Mishkan. That would include any sacrifice that was designated. You said, I'm only going to bring this as a sacrifice in the Mishkan, so that could not now be brought on a private altar. Korbanot hatzibur, public communal sacrifices had to be sacrificed in the Mishkan, craving by Mishkan. Korbanos hayachid babama, private sacrifices could be brought on a bama, on a private altar. Korbanos hayachid shula Mishkan, but if it was a private sacrifice which you designated to bring in the Mishkan, yikravu ba Mishkan, they would have to be brought in the Mishkan. V'im hikriva b'bama, and if you then went and brought them on a private altar, patur, you would be exempt. You're not allowed to do it, but you'd be exempt from the punishment of kares, because fundamentally there's no prohibition of shechutei chutz, because in principle you would have been allowed to bring it outside of the Beis Hamikdash. Ma bein bamas yachi lebamas sibur. What was the difference between a private altar and a public altar? So the Mishnah answers, smicha, you would only do placing of the hands on an offering inside the Mishkan or the Beis Hamikdash. Ushchitas safon, there was only a requirement to slaughter it in the north side if you were inside the Mishkan. Umatan saviv, and to put the blood around the sides of the around the corners of the altar. If it was a private altar, you just had to spill the blood. Utnufa, waving the sacrifice would only be done if it was inside the Mishkan or Beis Hamikdash. Vahagasha, and bringing the korban to the southwestern corner, that was only done inside the Mishkan or the Beis Hamikdash. Rabbi Yehuda says, Ein mincha babama. So, whereas there's an inference from the first position, from the Tana Kama, that you could bring a private mincha, Rabbi Yehuda says you would not be allowed to bring a mincha outside the Mishkan or outside the Beis Hamikdash. Well, definitely not outside the Beis Hamikdash, but outside the Mishkan. So, ein mincha babama, there was no mincha on a private altar, v'chihun, and it was always a kohen that had to bring the sacrifice inside the Mishkan. Ubigdei shares, they had to be wearing uniform. They wouldn't be wearing uniform outside. Uchlei shares, they had to use sanctified service vessels. V'reach nichoach, the pleasing aroma, the concept of putting raw meat on the mizbeach only had to happen inside the Mishkan, whereas outside you could roast them somewhere else first. Umechitza badamin, and with regards to the separation, the line that went around the altar, and some blood was sprinkled above that line, some blood was sprinkled below that line, that was only done on the Mishkan in the only done on the Mizbeach inside the Mishkan, or chutz yadayim v'raglayim, and washing hands and feet, that was only required for service inside the Mishkan, but not on private altars. Aval hazman, when it comes to the problem of sacrificing or consuming the korban beyond its designated time, which would make the korban pigul, or vahanosar, or if you have these offerings which are left beyond the time when they'd be allowed, vahatame, processing these things when you are or eating these things when you are tameh, shavin bazeh uvazeh, then they have equal prohibition inside the Mishkan and outside the Mishkan. You would not be allowed to violate those mitzvot, even outside on a private altar. With that, ladies and gentlemen, we say together the following words 3 times. Salik maseches Zevachim, Salik maseches Zevachim, Salik maseches Zevachim. Mazel tov, everybody, on completing Masechet Zevachim. And that is all for this week. Join us again next time when we will start the exciting world of Maseches Menachos. In the meantime, we wish you Mazel Tov. We'll see you again. Have a wonderful and meaningful evening. Take care.